So I love comedy book.
Oh, thank you.
I wasn't going to read it.
Really? I thought you'd at least read the parts about you, which is what a lot of comedians have done. When they've complimented the book, they're like, love the book. And I realize they mean the part I wrote about them in it.
When you go to a comedy show, is it like the character in Ratatouille going to a restaurant?
In a way, in the full arc of that movie, right? Because at the end of that movie, that critic likes things, right? So in so much as like, I think I have a really hard time when I feel like a comedian's being like cynical on stage and not giving their all. And so
say more about cynical.
I wish I had
because cynical's baked into comedy in a certain sense.
Not their point of view being cynical. I'm not saying being cynical in their perspective. I think you could be funny and cynical. I mean like cynical about the relationship to the audience, right? So they are seeing it as transactional. They're seeing the audience there as completely either working for them or not even trying to connect to the audience.
Right.
I mean the easiest example is if the audience doesn't laugh, criticizing them for not laughing.
Yes.
Right? You know, I often go to shows in Brooklyn. You'll see Manhattan comedians do shows there and be like, Brooklyn audiences, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And I was like, they're people too. These people could be your audience.
Right.
If you're coming into the show open, you can learn from this example.
Right.
And be like, oh, I need to change this joke if I want this audience. Because I'm pretty sure, well, depending, but I think like the biggest comedians figure out how to work in both spaces. So that's what I mean by cynical. Like they've already written off certain crowds, and as a result are just going through the motions of it.
Right. You call that out with Bill Burr. You basically say that he at a certain point called out the idea of like alternative comedy scenes are essentially like a group of friends laughing at each other.
Yeah.
And those people aren't willing to go to like clubs or like general spaces where like tourists are coming essentially.
Yeah, and I think that that was a perspective of that time. I think at this point the delineation between alternative comedy and mainstream comedy is quite confused because I think a lot of what we think of alternative comedy happens on the internet now and not in even like a union hall. But I do think like I've seen Bill at UCB type spaces and he will do well. Like he's not going to be like and if he is going to be calling them out, he's going to be doing it in a way funny enough that it wins them back. So I think I am quick to be like, we're doing that. Or like if someone's being a little bit hacky. And if an older comedian's being hacky. If you're new and you're still figuring out, I'll give you a lot of grace. They try to laugh more than I probably normally would.
Right.
At the same time, if I feel like I'm seeing someone doing something exciting or new, or just feel like, oh, I've seen them a few times, but they've really figured out their voice with this one part of one joke. I'm like very present there. I try to laugh really, really hard. I try to, if I know them or even don't know them.
I try to laugh really, really hard.
I try to not be observing. You know, I can be in an audience.
Yeah. An active participant in the audience.
And if it's like just I'm going to see a comedian, like a comedian that I know and they're working on their hour or whatever, I could just be in the audience. Like it's not like if I'm not planning on reviewing the show. I remember I saw Kyle Kinane, I guess it was a year ago, and he just had put out a special and he had already done like 25 minutes in this set, and he goes, okay, I got one more. So I thought maybe he has like another 15-minute thing max or whatever, and then he does a 45-minute story.
Oh God.
That's
wild.
It is now on a special and runs at 49 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah. It is huge.
You're a nerd.
Yeah, I think so.
You're like, it was 45 minutes. Now it's 49 minutes.
Well, I wrote a piece about it, so I'm like clocked it. And it's an absurd length, right?
Yeah. And he's a great comic.
He's a great comic, and he just is able to fill space and figured it out like I talked to him on my podcast, and he's just unwilling to accept that what he did was great. He's like, I'm just going up there and adding stuff here and there. It's like, most comedians aren't able to sustain an attention for 49 minutes.
Right.
Like you're able to do it, and you put a lot of work into doing that as well. But like, you're like, I don't know, just going up there. And I was like, that's not what you're doing. But
right. It's interesting because like one of the things that you talk about in the book is that the reviewer is on behalf of the reader, right?
Yeah.
And as opposed to on behalf of themselves or on behalf of the intelligentsia of comedy, let's say. But yet the economics of comedy right now run in direct contrast with writers like you are writing about. So like in other words, like if you look at that like pole star, it's Sebastian Maniscalco, it's Theo Von, it's this person, it's, you know what I mean? And that is the mass popularity of comedy. And I feel like, is it possible that the intelligentsia of comedy, which you're a part of, is missing it right now with that stuff?
I think we talk about it a lot, me and some of my coworkers, and it depends, right? It's like the biggest movies are Marvel movies or whatever, and movie critics tend to not write about those movies as much, right? It's not unusual for there to be this sort of divide.
Right.
And I've interviewed a lot of those people who are top Polestar number people. I interviewed Sebastian. I interviewed Bert Kreischer, you know?
Yeah.
So like that is a way. I think it is somewhat hard to write about a comedian who continues to do a pretty good job in the same exact way they've always done it.
Okay.
And I think on the other hand, a lot of audiences go to see a comedian because they want them to do a pretty good job of like recreating the thing they've seen them do before.
Sure.
And I think that creates a somewhat of divide. But I think if anything, my job is to the audience who learns to like comedy because of X comedian, and it was like, I'm really into stand-up. Who are other stand-ups?
Yeah.
Help them understand the comedians they might not naturally understand at first, right? They might be so confused if they see Sebastian, who's so physical, and then they see someone like Jacqueline Novak, let's say, who's like so wordy and there's so much going on there. They might not have an entry point. So like they listen to my podcast or maybe I would write about it. Then hopefully they have more of a foothold.
Right.
That is the hope of what I'm doing. I don't know if like Sebastian needs anyone to help audiences understand the appeal of it.
No, but that's interesting you should say that, because when you said that thing in the book, it made me think like, but are you nudging people intentionally towards things that are less popular, as opposed to like, my mom doesn't know who Sebastian is, but the odds are my mom might like Sebastian more than she'd like an alt comedian.
I'm trying to think if I'm intentionally nudging,
Are you intentionally nudging people towards having better comedy tastes in your perception?
Yes, I think I'm doing that. I think the idea that I am like, who are the comedians I like, and I'm pushing, that's not directly my directive, because I think there's quite popular comedians. Like I've written about Nate Bargatze, and he's like as big as a comedian is right now, right?
Wildly popular.
And I think if anything, I hope to help distinguish people who are quite big, who are doing something different or whatever. But I do think I'm trying to help refine people's taste.
Right.
And because I think...
I gotcha.
Yeah, that's fine. I think in the book I go like...
All right, that's a wrap, everybody.
Because if the audience has better taste, they demand more from their comedians. Like I'm not saying... Like ultimately, you'll have an instinct for why you are drawn to a certain comedian.
Right.
And I'm not saying stop seeing that comedian. I'm saying kind of demand more from them. Especially if they're doing quite well. And I think as you get bigger and bigger, it is harder for the audience to hold you accountable for being a little bit lazy.
Right.
I think all comedians, once they have an audience, some people are going to hang out with that comedian.
Right.
And that's good. I think there's a lot of potential there, but it also can create a problem where the comedian thinks like, well, I'm killing. This must be great material, right? They backwards engineer that they're doing great, where I think they're not holding themselves to the scrutiny that I would hope they would to keep on doing better and better work.
But then, like, when Shane hosted SNL, when Shane Gillis hosted SNL, you sort of were very critical of it. You said he bombed.
I think I was not reviewing his material, but reviewing how he responded to the nature of his material. Because I think in that piece, I say, like, he tends to be better at this than he did at SNL. And I think he came off quite nervous.
Oh, interesting.
Like, I think Shane's a better comedian than he was on SNL.
Yeah.
I think he came off as what it looks like when people haven't been on TV that much.
Do you think Shane's one of the best comedians in the world?
One of the best? I'm trying to think of how many comedians I include to include Shane.
Top 100.
Yes.
Interesting. Top 50?
Yes.
Top 20?
That I don't know. 50 I can take.
That's a wrap. We're done. We're done here.
I think his potential is tremendous. Like I think
he's a wildly charismatic person. Certainly.
And when he's really on and really good, and there's parts of both his specials, and I'm like, this is as good as people are doing. I think he, as any comedian, as they keep on getting bigger, has the danger of an audience that is not holding him accountable. Not in terms of ethics, in terms of just like not resting on the perspective that they just want to see.
Do you think critics, you're sometimes a critic, sometimes not a critic, etc., but do you think you and your fellow journalists of comedy are taking moral stances on comedians in ways that no one did on Richard Pryor, for example, Bill Hicks, countless other comedians? I think in different generations.
I think there's a few things. One, there really weren't like active comedy critics.
Of course, yeah.
But like the example I cite in the book is that the Eddie Murphy thing, right? People like now be like, it's so hard to watch Eddie Murphy, but it's a different time. It's like at the time, people complained about Eddie Murphy doing those jokes.
Sure.
So it is a little bit of being like, well, now everyone's so moral. It's like,
right.
No, it's just now the people with certain morality have more of a platform to talk about it. I try not to do it because I don't think I'm good at it, me personally. Like, I don't want to speak for other journalists or whatever. I think there are plenty of journalists that have a moralist nature to them. I'm just not good at it. I'm more like, I think I try to be more of a formalist and try to analyze why, like the Dave Chappelle thing, right? So this is probably the most vivid example. I feel like the chapter where I talk about Dave Chappelle is not being like he shouldn't do this. It's immoral to talk about these things. That's not the perspective of that chapter. I'm saying that like his reliance on shock comedy and like hot button issues has made it so he's a lazier comedian than he was when he wasn't doing that as much. And I think Chappelle is so charismatic and so able to kind of get away with anything that his audience has misconstrued what he's doing as being sort of important or interesting when he just is inherently feels important and feels interesting, where I feel like, if anything, so that's the line that I personally draw, because I think that is my place in writing this book. Sure, I'm sure my morals and my perspective come through this book. Like, the book is not, I'm not saying it's like a non-partisan book, but like, it's my book,
It's my book.
Like, there's only so much you can do to remove yourself from the book. And then at some point I was like, well, it is my book. Like, people should read it and be like, this is a person writing it.
Well, it's so funny because Adam Gopnik said critical things about it in the New Yorker, which I like Adam. I like his writing. I like him personally. I disagree with his criticism of your book. His criticism of your book, and I'll boil it down, is you didn't cover the whole of history of comedy, and you didn't cover Nichols and May and this and that and Shecky Green and blah blah blah. And it's like, yeah, man, but the book literally states in the prologue, this is about 1990. This book is about 1991 through 2020. It's like, you can't criticize someone's book for not being the book you wanted to read.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I found so odd is that he made a list of the comedians I didn't mention. And those are just the comedians I didn't mention. I mentioned more comedians in this book than I think probably most people have ever known at any time. I know, and including, Richard Pryor, Shelley Berman. Like, there's comedians I reference of the past 70 whatever years. I just didn't reference Bob Hope, and so he clearly, because the second chapter is history, right? The second chapter is like, here's the entire history of American live comedy performance. Condensed, because there are books that cover that part. And the original draft had it much longer, and like, readers like, this is boring. Can you make it tighter? And I was like, yeah, I can make it tighter. Like, otherwise, you're just making a list of every single person and what they did, which is a thing I have done. I've done 2 lists of 100 jokes that shaped modern comedy, which are my attempts at doing a sort of history. So I thought
did it hurt your feelings to have a critic criticize you?
I wasn't saddened by it. I was like annoyed because it did feel like an unfair criticism. And I didn't like the idea that people read The New Yorker and they think this is what the book is.
Yes.
And then I specifically didn't like the idea that Steve Martin would read the article,
right,
and think,
right, and that you were that you felt mischaracterized
yes,
or misconstrued.
I've had negative criticism that I like quite a bit. One of my favorite comments on the book was a negative review on Goodreads. It essentially said it had first book problems, and first it was just nice that they thought of me as an author that like will have books.
It had first book problems,
and it essentially says they said it was too much. There's too much in it. And I go,
interesting.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah,
like I didn't realize that. Like I read that review, and it was actually around the same time I interviewed Jacqueline Novak on my podcast, and I saw her a similar desire to be like, I want to maximize to the audience. I want to give as much as I have. I have all of these things that have been storing up, and I'm going to try to figure out a way to make the book as readable as possible while including every single thing possible about me, both my sort of sense of humor and the nature of who I am as a writer, and basically every single opinion I've had. So when they said it's too much, I was like, exactly. Like It should, for the people who like the book, it should feel borderline overwhelming, but not. So for that to be the case, some people need to be like, whoa, 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 whoa. But I didn't want to write that type of book.
In that way, the book is edgy.
Yeah.
At being nerdy.
Yeah, I think so.
Yep.
We're like, whoa, this is provocative. I didn't realize.
Too much information.
It's like, whoa, I did not.
A shocking amount of knowledge.
So that was like, this person gets me almost more than the people who just sort of like the book. Okay.
That's great. I feel the same way about reviews. I had one review once where someone in a very prominent publication said something about my work that was widely read that was just an ad hominem attack of my life. And I was kind of like loosely based on the show.
Yeah.
And I was just like, this hurts my feelings. Like, you just clearly don't like me.
I do think that reflects one of the hard things about like reviewing stand-up, which is like, it's the person, right? It's not like there are people that work on it, but often you're reviewing this person and their personal ideas and they're expressing it. And, if there's something even being like, when you're reviewing there's like times where like, this person is not charismatic as other comedians. Like, to put that in a review would be really hurtful. Right. Like,
that was a line from Sleepwalk with Me where I go, it's painful as a comedian when you bomb, because the audience is not just saying we don't like your comedy. It's like, we don't like you as a person, like, your personality.
Yeah, and that's hard, right? And then it's like you're sharing your ideas, and you're like, oh, this person's really good at writing jokes, but they actually have like not interesting ideas, which is like, if you transfer that to like a painter, you can be like, wow, this still life is beautiful.
Right.
You can have that without having to worry about their ideas, because you can kind of just glance at it.
You don't go, Matisse seems like a dick.
Yeah. He seems a great guy. But like Picasso.
right. Picasso obviously was a dick. Yeah.
I have to defend Matisse at all times. But yes, that is the problem. But like, it's a dicier area, and I try as much as possible. I mean, like, again, like, it's still a new field. There's only so many people doing some version of this. And like, if anything, the goal of the book, which I think I put in, it was just like, now hopefully more people could write books like this where they voice their opinion on this stuff. I have talked to people whose favorite comedians are the comedians I'm sort of more negative on the book. And it was a very useful conversation, because he both disagreed with sort of my conclusions, but thought it was fair in sort of my perspective on it. And that's fine. Like, ultimately, like, I hope people read it and have their own opinions. I don't want them to just ape my opinions. Like, the hope is like, make people better thinkers about comedy, because I think that would improve the sort of general discourse. Yeah,
and I like that part of the book too, is that you point out that it's made you a better consumer of comedy, writing about it and analyzing it, and made your ears more open and your eyes more open to different types of comedy and inside of it. As a critic, you've covered me for years, which is why this whole interview is a wild conflict of interest.
Sure.
But what would be your criticism of me? And would you be reluctant to criticize me now because we know each other and have worked together on this documentary, et cetera?
In terms of if you were put out a show and I thought the show was bad, would I write like a negative review? I mean, again, I'm not put in the position to do that. I think
because you're not a critic on staff, you're a writer at large.
Yes, I'm a senior. I just learned my job titles. I think senior writer. or something like that.
Senior writer at Vulture, New York Magazine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, like, it would be harder for me to write like a regular pan because I know so much more about where you're coming from than if I were to come in cold. I think if I had a piece that I thought was interesting to write about why you're bad, I would consider writing about it. If you did something that I thought was less. That's the thing about in terms of how I approach the idea of like writing criticism about comedy at all, is that it's more about like, because there's so many specials now and so many people just want to know that they exist. Like, we're still at the point where people don't know they exist. We're not at the point where everyone knows the big movies that are coming out, the big TV shows. That I think a lot more of my work is sort of contextualizing and explaining what things are. Yep. It's why the bigger comedians, it's fair, I think, for them to get criticism because they are bigger and everyone knows. Everyone's like going to the Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle specials. Right. So if you did something lesser, for whatever reason, it's hard to know. I mean, I have to imagine what your worst hour would be. Right. I would have to figure out what is the angle and what is the point I'm trying to make by doing this. Right.
What's your overall criticism of me in the last decade? Like, where my comedy is lesser than what it strives to be.
Well, here's a question I was going to ask you, and I feel like when I first saw the new one, you cried at the end.
Oh my God, Jesus, yeah, that makes sense.
And it was really powerful. It is a thing I think about almost every single day. You cry at the end where you say through the baby's eyes or whatever. Yeah. And truly, I think about it as a new father. I think about it all the time. Yeah. On the Netflix special, it's kind of like a little light joke at the end. Same line.
I get choked up, actually. I've seen the footage really tight.
But it's not as intense.
Yeah. Well, early on, it's raw. Yeah.
Yeah. And I do, and this is more of a question I would ask than like you need to be raw, right? It's just a question of like, is there a thing that you lose in the performance? Or is there something that an audience would gain from being a more raw version of it?
Yeah, I think that that's fair. And I think it's something I'm confronting right now because I've been talking recently about my relationship with my dad. His health has been failing, and I've had moments where I've cried on stage recently. Yeah. And that will probably fall away over time. And I'm never going to contrive that.
Yeah.
That would be insane. To me, that would be sociopathic, as if you contrived a fake crying situation. Sure. But yeah, I get that. As a note, though, is how do you bring that emotion to the next stage of the show? That's a good note.
It is a thing that, because I think there's so much gained in what you do and how you do it, right? Like, I think when you see one-person shows or hours in general that people don't put as much time in as you, there just isn't it doesn't all feel as intentional, and you don't feel as sort of like you're following the story and you feel comfortable. And you don't feel as it is a whole piece in the same way, and as a result, you're not impacted in the same way as they do when people watch your shows. Yeah. But it is a thing of like, you don't get the other thing, that's sort of the vulnerability that a comedian can get from just like, here it is. I'm not going to present it to you so raw that it's like somewhat dangerous, but I do wonder if that's just a question. I don't know. Like,
well, Gerard did a great job of capturing it in a moment. So he with Raphael, he filmed it basically on 30 performances. Yeah. And as opposed to me, I work on these things for 2-3 years, and he was opening up about a thing that was deeply personal to him. I can say this because people who listen to this podcast probably know. He essentially came out of the closet in the special in real time, publicly. And I had a thing recently where I went back to Walla Walla, where I jumped through a second story window, sleepwalking 20 years ago, and I filmed a lot of footage of me performing. It was pretty emotional, actually. Yeah, I'll be interested to see when that comes out, what you think of it, because it's
terrible.
Well, no, it's precisely the thing you're actually saying, which is, where's the Gerard of it all? Where's the rawness of, he hasn't done this 1,000 times. Like, I'm only going to Walla Walla once.
Yeah,
or twice. First for the jump, second for the recap. But it is that. It's interesting. Like, I find the discussion of the Chris Rock stuff enthralling, because I similarly am fascinated by Chris Rock's process. I've watched him at the Cellar probably 30, 40 times, where he's doing the thing you describe in the book, which is he takes away the Chris Rock affect that's so famous, the Chris Rock voice that's so famous, and he just goes, what else? And he like literally reads from a note card, and and you hear him do the material without an effect, and it's quite remarkable.
Well, especially if you only know of him as the person who kills harder than anyone has ever done, right? If you know what Bigger and Blacker looks like, right?
Yeah.
The hardest anyone's, I think, ever killed in a special is Bigger and Blacker.
Unbelievable.
And then you just see a person bomb harder than you could ever imagine doing it.
Yeah.
Because even if a joke is good, he's stepping on laughs, right? It's like wild.
It's wild.
And he just will do it for the one I write in the book, he did for a full hour. After a full, it was the end of a show. He goes on at Night Train, which was at Littlefield, and he just for a full hour.
Yeah.
Coat on.
Next show, yeah. Yeah. No, his coat on. Yeah, you said he had his puffy coat on. So what you acknowledge in that section is that stand-up comedy is one of the only art forms where the art form process is taking place with an audience.
Yeah.
Which is why I got frustrated when you reviewed Mulaney in process.
Sure.
Because he pretty explicitly was like, hey, don't review this.
So you want me to defend that I did that?
Oh, if you would. Or just be silent.
Sure, I'll be silent.
I was defensive of him both as a friend and as a comedian.
Sure. I debated it. I didn't go into it planning on it. I trusted the judgment also of people around me who I think have a clear sense of like what is journalistically appropriate, right? Like because comedy is new in this sort of way where it's sort of like, I think if I remember correctly, Jason Zinnemann is like, he tries, he tends to review people when they're doing big shows or whatever, or if they're in New York or something like that, then it counts as a big show. But I think the main thing I thought about when I wrote it is I don't know who else was there. I don't know who's going to night 2 or night 3 of those shows, what they're going to write about it. They are more likely to write just pulling, they're just going to be like, they're going to be more likely to be like a tabloid, more of a tabloid angle, right? This is what he said about this part about this.
Right.
It's just a factual.
This is what he said about the divorce. This is what he said about his addiction, etc.
And I found myself there with an opportunity to help, and if anything, like I do think it's maybe even immoral or like journalistically complicated because I was trying to be of use. In some ways, like I did think I wanted to contextualize people as they see more of these shows, because I think people had a certain expectation for John because he's John, right? He not only are his fans, but I think he's just always been so good,
right? If
you've ever seen John ever, he's just always so good, and I think there's a sort of burden. And I think I wrote about that predicament that one would be in, and I think I was trying to help people understand what this thing is, more so than say if this thing is good or bad. I'd have to go back and read it. I mean, I redid part of it for the book because I think I had a larger point even in the book and whatever, but I think that was sort of my justification for doing it. I don't think you are going to do that very often with a comedian. Like there is ultimately a news value to this. This has been deemed news that John was doing this. Same thing like, when Chris Rock's first shows back, like people went to those first shows and just wrote what he said. So I think that was sort of my justification for it. I really am proud of it as a piece of writing. I think the response I got from it, I feel has helped me come to terms justifying doing it, in so much as that people really liked it, and in a way that was like, I think they found it, how would I put it? I think people were worried about John. I think they read that and they felt a little bit more understanding, and I think that helped people understand what the shows they were going to go see are. I know reading on Reddit, like people that were talking about like, oh, this is kind of what to expect. Don't go in wanting X, Y, and Z. And I think that's what I'm saying. I'm writing for the audience in that regard, because I do think if they're going in, in a more salacious angle, I don't think that's for the best of stand-up. I don't know.
I think some people in the comedy community, think myself included, find it to be one of the more craven journalistic choices in comedy writing in the last 20 years.
That piece.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I've got other responses from people in comedy who like the piece.
Name names?
I don't remember. It was a while ago. I think that is unfair to what the piece was, and then ignoring what then happened the days afterwards. Right?
Okay.
There's other articles that came out that day. Other people were at that first show. Like, I believe Rolling Stone or someone wrote about it, and it was what would happen if there was no... It was just sort of, here's the things he said, here's an account for it, here's the information that he talks about in it. And I think mine was an attempt to try to keep it in the perspective of someone working on something and trying to understand it. But I understand. I mean, like, if comedians I don't know. Like, do you feel like there's many comedians have held it against me? You still talk to me. You did the documentary.
Oh yeah, I don't hold it. I don't hold it against you, other than that I clocked it as something that made me concerned about what I would say on stage in the confines of 200 people in an audience, which I think is a concern for comedians. Okay, if people can write about this, well, maybe I won't say the most candid version of this.
Yes.
Even there was a joke that I made on a show that you booked. That was a benefit that Padma Lakshmi had recently at the Bell House, which was a super fun show, where I had just come back from visiting my dad, had struggled with his health, and I made some jokes that were wild, and like and someone was filming it, and I was like, oh, actually don't film, and I said to them, I go, this is for this group of people, and that's special, and that's what's cool about all of us being here in the room at the same time, and I'm just very protective of that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it is a complaint, that sort of, especially the filming it, is a complaint that specifically the biggest comedians in the world have complained about like 10 years ago, right? Like, like Kevin Hart, Chris Rock, especially were like, and
pouches people putting phones in pouches,
and you sort of didn't believe it when they were complaining about it. You're like, how can this be a problem?
Yeah.
And I do think as generations go on and people have less of where their phones are more connected to them and their understanding of what the experience is even more and more about filming it. It just become more normalized and they wouldn't know the difference. I do think or hope that my piece is, if anything, is on the same side as the people who are against the filming of things. In so much as, like, I don't think the audience knew, right? I was at that show. There's audience members there who did not know how to behave. And in many ways, I think if I remember in the piece, I call out the people's bad behavior.
Okay.
And I think it's because there are people in the audience who kind of cheered on his drug use.
Okay.
And I do think I was like, okay, we need to sort of, it goes back to like a better informed audience of what is happening in the process, like where he is in the process, right? Like I do think part of that piece was just telling people what this is. So they know how to engage in it and know that they shouldn't be filming it. I didn't write at the top, don't film it. But that, because it's like the thing that you said, to not film you're working on something, is something I know. When did I learn that? How did I learn that? Well, I'm a freaking giant nerd. I've listened to every single comedy podcast like 12 years ago, and I heard a million comedians say that. Not everyone's doing that. They haven't listened to it. If anything, they're not going back 12 years to listen to early episodes of You Made It Weird where that was talked about a bunch, let's say. So they'll get this information where they get it, and possibly that me writing about it will have them take this early stage more seriously.
Yeah.
Maybe. And maybe not. I don't think I normalized writing about it because it was news. Like, I think ultimately the biggest comedians in the world, almost anything like Pete Davidson, right? When Pete Davidson does anything, there's people who write about it. In stand-up shows. It's terrible. Like he locks up his phones, people still get around it.
Right.
It really sucks. Being really famous is not helpful really for your comedy in a lot of ways. There's some ways it is helpful because you can counter a public image one has of yourself, which is like Richard Pryor, probably a great example. But like, yeah, it's really hard. Like I can understand not liking that it happened. I can understand being like, this is raw and someone's writing about it. Like, I obviously care about the writing process. I know it's a sensitive space. That's part of like, when we made the documentary about you, I knew it was asking a lot because I do think the creative process is a sensitive space. And if anything, I was hoping to capture that it is a sensitive space.
Yeah. And that was why I put a lot of faith in you and Eddie Schmidt and Seth Meyers and the whole team that made that documentary. I was very self-conscious.
Yeah.
Even I was nervous watching back what it would be. I mean, I said this on Seth Meyers' show the other day, but it's like, you guys could have done a supercut of me eating fries. And be like, I guess that's what Mike Birbiglia is all about, just eating fries. He's always eating fries. Because that's the control you have as the editor of someone else, which I'm usually the editor of myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, I think it might have helped that I also had so much more control over when I do the podcast. I come with questions, and I also go through the edit and what is essentially edited in the episodes or the things that I say to edit, right?
Yeah.
So, but though I am a producer on the thing, I was not holding the cameras. I wasn't necessarily telling people where to shoot. I did do a lot of the interviews, but there were parts that I didn't. And I was like, what is the tone of this thing going to be?
Yeah.
So I do think I think it helped that we're all going to figure out what this thing is. We don't have control over it. Like, ultimately, I did realize that like a lot of the best parts are things that could not be controlled, or this feeling of not being controlled, or like when you let it slip or whatever. I mean, there is things also I saw in that I think was really interesting in terms of when thinking about you as a comedian. Because there's one show where you're so looser than I've ever seen you.
Yeah.
Because we filmed.
We shot so much.
9 shows.
It was so much.
And there was one where you're so loose. And I was like, and it's beautiful, but I was like, oh, I wish more people could see this.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's funny you should say that. That's one of the things Mulaney always says to me, is that he wishes that I filmed myself doing just a hour of stand-up with no narrative arc, because people, I think he says people don't realize sometimes that I do that too. Yeah.
And and there's that aspect gets into all your shows, but it's like, it's very deliberately used. And I think it's great and artful, but it is just sort of like, it's the hard thing with almost all specials. The thing is, like, the thing that you're able to do there is it's so hard to film for anybody.
Yeah.
Which is this feeling of, it all makes sense because we're all playing together. Like, it feels the most of like what it feels like when stand-up is like improv.
Well, let me pick that apart. So you're saying I seemed looser.
Yeah.
Can you have a specific example of anything I said or did where you're like, oh, that would be cool if he transplanted that energy into the final version?
No, I wish I could.
That's okay.
I know there just was.
Because I've been trying for years to figure out how to. My wife Jenny calls these shows that you're talking about, where I'm being loose, the working it out shows, as she calls them affectionately, the Jim Morrison shows, where it just like doesn't feel like there's any rules.
Yeah,
and
it's just riffing and being dumber than I think you normally are.
Yeah,
and there's something about not good jokes.
Yes,
that
I agree
if done well, and if the audience knows that you are able to do good jokes, is a beautiful thing. And it's more like how people talk to each other. It's like human beings don't have perfectly crafted jokes.
Well, it's the great inside joke of stand-up comedy, which you talk about also. This idea of, as an audience, we're all in on the inside joke of the comedian that the comedian's creating. I have a question though, because the Sandler thing really interested me, because you're like, I love Sandler.
Yeah.
And you're like, critics didn't get it.
Mm-hmm.
This movie was 30% on Rotten Tomatoes. This movie was 20%. Jack and Jill was 10%, whatever.
Sure, yeah.
and I agree with you. I think Sandler is like one of the crown jewels of comedy who has been underestimated for years and years and years. And critics have really missed it. Critics have really, and the award shows have really missed it. Who do you think it's possible we're missing it with right now?
It's a great question. Oh, this is actually quite obvious. Kevin Hart.
Oh, Kevin Hart's hilarious. I agree.
The amount of times a thing like Kevin Hart is not funny trends on Twitter or something like that is remarkable to me. It's a common. There was a Washington Post article about how Kevin Hart's not funny when he won the Mark Twain Prize. I didn't read the article because it was just like Kevin Hart's not funny, and I was like, I've read this type of article about whoever before, and I do think one for that person, part of the issue is by the time mainstream white people learned who Kevin Hart was, he already had proven himself quite a bit in terms of his stand-up specials and whatever. So by the time they heard about him, he was already making huge blockbuster comedies,
right,
which are not what critics tend to like.
Right.
And I think he is so big that you forget that, like, ultimately, like, he's very good at the job of it. He's very funny. He is trying his hard to, like, do interesting material. I think a comedian of his size, which is as big as a comedian's ever been, really could phone it in and still do it.
Yes.
And I think he's trying his hardest not to.
Well, he wakes up at 4 a.m. and he does calisthenics.
And he has people help with his material, but, like, ultimately it's not going to be like when he's first breaking through.
Yeah. Like,
there's an urgency to that, and you know, he had more personal stories then because those were the stories of his childhood, and he used them up. But, like, I think he's good, and I think we'll look back, and I think people will be like, oh, we kind of maybe underrated this person, despite, again, he's doing quite well. But the same thing happened with Adam, right? Where it's like he was so big that it was easy to be like, he sucks, because who else are you going to say sucks?
Who do you think's who could be the next person who is that? Because people always say to me, and I'm sure they say this to you with your podcast, people always say, thanks for introducing me to Maddie Weiner, for example. Like, thanks for introducing me, you know, to Joe Firestone or whoever it is. And it's like, who do you think that might be?
It's like trying to think of the exact level of person.
Who do you have that with even just your podcast, where people's feedback is, I didn't know about this person?
I mean, I remember introducing people to Matt and Bowen, Matt Rogers and Bowen Yang, before Bowen was on SNL, and then Matt has gone to the success.
You discovered them. You discovered Matt and Bowen.
Yeah. I get all the credit. I helped usher what would be their guaranteed success. Same thing with Catherine Cohen when I had her on. Trying to think of who else. I mean, Jay Jordan, I think, is going to find quite an audience for himself. Brittany Carney. I'd be very excited to see where Rosebud Baker goes. Who are comedians? I remember when I saw Taylor Tomlinson, I was like, well, you'll play stadiums if you want to play stadiums. Oh my
God, yeah. Same. Immediately, just like, wow, this person is just like a joke writer extraordinaire.
Yeah, and it's just sort of like you tap into a thing young people have that you just can't.
Yeah, you can't fake.
You can't fake that.
What are your pet peeves of comedians that drive you crazy?
The number one is the attacking the audience for not laughing at a joke.
I hate it.
I hate it. It's very frustrating because they're giving you information that is useful, right? So it's like, why would you be like,
the audience is giving you information that's useful, which is, we think this is funny or we don't think this is funny.
Yeah. So why would you? So don't be mad at.
Here's where I think this comes from.
Yeah.
And I think I've done it over the years. I hate it when I do it, but I think it comes from an combined insecurity of, I'm exposing myself and revealing how I feel about this thing, and the audience is like, nope.
Yeah.
And that hurts. Right?
Yeah.
And so you want the knee-jerk defensiveness comes in, and then you verbalize it because you have a microphone sometimes, and it's the worst. It's not fun.
I also think, like, bombing and starting is so hard that it is probably traumatic to some people, and the way people process that is to build an armor around themselves.
Yeah.
So they go into shows defensively, and I just don't like that energy. Like, obviously, some great comedy can come out of that, right? It's like you're cornered, and as a result, you have to think of something funny to say, and then your brain comes up with something you might not think otherwise.
Yeah.
But I do think it also results in a sort of knee-jerk, they didn't laugh, they're wrong.
There's like a famous, maybe apocryphal line from Colin Quinn, which is, you're a real comedian when you're killing and you still hate the audience. Which I don't agree with, but I think is a hilarious, like, encapsulation of like a certain type of worldview. Yeah. But I want to say, like, this brings up a larger question for me about the nature of provocateurs.
Sure.
Because, like, often I will say, people will be surprised. I'll say, who are your favorite comedians? And I'll go, Doug Stanhope and Maria Bamford.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, what? Like, those two people, similar to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Are of a certain DNA. I actually think Maria and Doug, though they talk about completely different things, are of the same DNA. And that DNA is strap in.
Yeah.
This is going to be wild. Like when you watch Maria Bamford live, there's nothing like it in the world. When you watch Doug Stanhope live, there's nothing like it in the world. Either of them, I don't agree with this view. I could go one by one. Is it possible to be a provocateur in this era as a comedian, that to be your genre, and have critical acceptance?
It's interesting because I think it's a question of what are you provoking and what do you do with those provocations. I think all these sort of questions that are in this space, it's a question of like, what do you mean by possible, right? So it's like, let's say you're like Dave Chappelle, well, he's a provocateur, but he can't do that now, except for he can. He's doing quite well, or Bill Maher or whatever, right? These people are the most successful comedians working. But I think you're saying in terms of critical. I think there is a lot of people who just ultimately their value system does not think that is the most valuable thing a comedian can do. Like, for example, I talked to Rami on my podcast recently and he was saying essentially like, we don't really need Bill Hicks and George Carlin anymore.
Yeah.
Speaking of being provocative, like that was at a time where there weren't spaces for people to be provocative in the
right.
middle. And now there are spaces for people to be provocative. And I think that gets at a larger question of, at a time when there's so much content, what is the role of the comedian? Right? And that's the same thing as I write about in the book in terms of being getting laughs, right? Is the comedian's number one job to be the purveyor of laughs in society? It's like, well, if so, there are other purveyors of laughs right now that people seemingly approve, which is staying at home and looking at their phone and laughing at the dumb stuff they like on their phone.
Yeah.
Which sucks, right? Yeah. I don't think that's better, but it is the truth. So the comedian probably needs to be doing something more.
Right. It has to be, well, it certainly has to be funny.
Yeah.
And it certainly has to be something that you take away something more than you came in with, which is, there's, Andrew Schultz said this to me recently. It was really interesting. He goes, we're living in like hot take culture right now. So in some ways, by telling personal stories, it's kind of like all you can do.
Yeah.
Because everything's a take.
Yeah. And I think there are, I'm fine saying Dave Chappelle's name. He doesn't know I exist, so it's fine. But like, I think Dave Chappelle the problem with almost all of this was that he like, what matters to Dave Chappelle? Like, I feel like we're losing the sense of who he is as a person. And sometimes this stuff, these provocations feel like guards and ways to distract. It's a magician being like, look over here and don't look over here.
Don't look over here. This has been a fascinating conversation. Your book is great.
Thank you.
Congratulations. I mean, I've known you for a lot of years, and I was so happy for you that you wrote this fantastically thorough book and thoughtful book.
Oh, thank you.
And even though I disagree with some of your choices over the years, there's other choices you disagree with. I do appreciate you as a writer. And thanks for writing this book. And we always close with working out for a cause. Is there an organization you like to contribute to?
Yes. National Network of Abortion Funds, which is the
same organization we were raising money for with Padma Lakshmi.
And they just pay for abortions. They help pay people they pay for abortions. They help people who are trying to get abortions in terms of other things necessary, funding and logistics and stuff like that.
Great. We're going to contribute to them. We are going to link to them in the show notes, encourage people to contribute as well. Thank you, Jesse Fox.
Thank you for having me.